started with a knock on the door. A moment so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one could have predicted it would mark the beginning of a horror story that would last 7 years. On May 19, 1977, in the quiet town of Eugene, Oregon, a 20-year-old woman named Colleen Stan said goodbye to her friends and stepped out into the warm spring air. She was going to visit a friend for a birthday party, planning to hitchhike the 400-mile trip south to Northern California. Hitchhiking in the 1970s was common, even romanticized, seen as a free-spirited act of trust and adventure. Colleen had done it before. She was cautious, selective, and confident. But that day, she made a decision that would cost her nearly everything. A blue Dodge Colt pulled over. Inside was a clean-cut man, his young wife, and their baby in a car seat. It seemed safe. Who would suspect danger from a family? Colleen smiled and accepted the ride. It would be one of the last times she made a decision freely for the next 2,536 days. The man behind the wheel was Cameron Hooker, a lumber mill worker in his early 20s. On the surface, he appeared mild, soft-spoken, and harmless. But beneath that unassuming exterior lurked a mind consumed by sadistic fantasies, twisted power, and the urge to control. His wife, Janice, sat quietly in the passenger seat. She held their infant daughter gently, saying little as Colleen chatted politely. There were no red flags, no warning signs, just the hum of the engine, the soft laughter of the baby, and the blur of trees passing outside the window. But something shifted about an hour into the ride. Cameron suddenly turned off the highway and onto a desolate, isolated dirt road. Colleen's stomach tightened. "Where are we going?" she asked. No answer. He stopped the car. Then everything happened fast. Cameron pulled out a knife and ordered Colleen to stay quiet. Janice did nothing. The baby cried. And before Colleen could scream, she was blindfolded, gagged, and her hands tied behind her back. A strange, heavy wooden box was placed over her head, tight, suffocating, and designed to block light and sound completely. This was no random abduction. This was premeditated. And that box was just the beginning. What makes someone capable of keeping a person imprisoned for 7 years? And how can a victim survive, not just physically but mentally, through almost a decade of psychological and physical torture? This is the story of Colleen Stan, a woman the media would later call the girl in the box. But behind the headlines and sensational titles lies a reality more terrifying than most horror films. Because this is real, and every minute of it happened. After the abduction, Cameron and Janice Hooker drove Colleen to their home in Red Bluff, California, a modest white house that hid unspeakable horrors within its walls. Deep in the basement, Cameron had built a secret chamber. But even that wasn't where Colleen would be kept. Not yet. He took her to the cellar, stripped of her clothes, chained to the ceiling, left hanging for hours, the box still over her head, muffling her breath, silencing her voice. Days passed before he removed it. By then, the world outside no longer felt real. Her name felt distant. Her past life, her parents, her dreams, her identity, had already begun to slip away. Cameron wasn't just trying to break her body. He wanted to destroy her mind and rebuild her as something else. What followed were weeks of systematic torture. He starved her, electrocuted her, burned her, beat her, forced her to endure unimaginable acts, always with the same mechanical precision, always with the box. But physical torment was only one part of the trap. The other was psychological, and it was even more insidious. Cameron told Colleen she had been selected by an all-powerful, secret organization known as the Company. According to him, the Company controlled everything. They watched her every move. If she tried to escape, they would kill her. If she screamed, they would torture her family. If she disobeyed, she'd be taken away, never seen again. It was a complete fabrication. But to Colleen, isolated, malnourished, terrified, and alone, it felt entirely real. That belief became the cage, and it was more effective than chains. After several months, Cameron offered Colleen a contract, a literal document, typed and signed, where she agreed to be his slave in exchange for survival. It detailed what she could and could not do, how she should behave, how she would be punished. He made her sign it while blindfolded and naked, with Janice watching. Colleen was no longer Colleen. She was now just Kay, an object, possession, a thing. 4 years, she lived in a coffin-sized box underneath Cameron and Janice's bed. It was barely large enough to curl into. No light, no air circulation, no voice. For up to 23 hours a day, she lay in silence, listening to the footsteps above her. His voice, the creak of the bed, the sound of life she could not participate in. She was only let out to be tortured, abused, or forced into servitude. And the hookers lived their lives around her as if she didn't exist. But what makes this story even more surreal is what happened outside that box. Because over time, Colleen wasn't just kept in the house. She was allowed into the backyard, taken for walks, even allowed to visit her family, under Cameron's watch, of course. But the mental programming was so strong, so complete, that she never tried to escape. She never even whispered a word of warning. When she sat with her parents during a brief visit, frail, pale, and distant, they thought she had joined a cult. She smiled, told them she was happy, and then disappeared again. They never knew the truth, because she didn't know how to explain it. Cameron had twisted her reality so deeply that the outside world now felt more dangerous than the prison. He had convinced her that he was her protector, from the company, from punishment, from chaos, that obeying him was the only way to survive. And Colleen, like many long-term captives, adapted to survive. It's easy to judge from the outside. Why didn't she run? Why didn't she scream? Why didn't she fight? But the truth is far more complicated. When your entire world is manipulated, when every decision is punished, when your sense of self is stripped away piece by piece, survival becomes the only thing that matters. And to survive, Colleen learned to disappear inside herself. But even monsters make mistakes. And one day, Cameron Hooker went too far. Not with Colleen, but with his wife. Janice had always been complicit. She had stood by as Colleen was abused. In fact, she had been promised that if she allowed Cameron to keep a slave, he would stop hurting her. But promises break, and Janice began to realize that she was just another prisoner. In 1984, 7 years after Colleen had been taken, Janice finally reached a breaking point. She took Colleen aside and whispered the truth. There is no company. It shattered everything Colleen believed. And in that moment, the door to her prison cracked open. The rest of the escape is astonishing, painful, and filled with emotion. But that moment of realization was the true turning point. Colleen wasn't trapped by walls. She was trapped by lies. And once those lies broke, so did the chains. But the road to freedom was still long. And justice? That's an entirely different story. The days blended into one another. Time lost all meaning. For Colleen Stan, existence became a cycle of fear, obedience, and silence. She was no longer a person with a life, a family, dreams. She was now a possession. The wooden box she was kept in beneath the hooker's waterbed became more than a prison. It was her world, roughly 3 feet long, 2.5 feet high, and 3 feet wide. The coffin-like enclosure was lined with insulation to mute any sound she might make. There was no light, no air circulation. Summer heat turned the inside into an oven, and winter brought paralyzing cold. She lay there curled in fetal position for up to 23 hours a day. Each morning, Cameron Hooker would lift the waterbed, release her from the box, and lead her to the bathroom, always blindfolded. One misstep, one incorrect word, could mean punishment. Afterward, she would be fed and returned to darkness. Her only source of hope, the thought that maybe, just maybe, someone was looking for her. But as the months turned to years, that hope began to fade. Colleen wasn't just being physically imprisoned. Cameron was psychologically rewiring her perception of reality. And the key to this control was something he called the company. Cameron told Colleen that the company was a powerful, secret organization that monitored slaves like her. They punished escape attempts, tortured families of escapees, and watched every move. He claimed the company had recruited him as a handler, and if Colleen ever disobeyed, they would not only kill her, but also harm her family. It was a lie, but a convincing one. Colleen, already traumatized and isolated, believed every word. And this belief was Cameron's ultimate weapon. She signed a fake contract declaring herself a slave for life. She stopped resisting. She stopped asking questions. The fear of the company dictated everything she did. Janice, Cameron's wife, played a critical role in maintaining this illusion. Though she initially objected to her husband's fantasies, over time she complied. She convinced herself it was temporary, that no real harm would come to Colleen. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was complicit. Cameron began allowing Colleen out of the box for longer periods. He gave her chores. She cooked, cleaned, and even cared for the hooker's young children. Neighbors occasionally saw her, but she was introduced as a live-in nanny. No one suspected a thing, and Colleen, still terrified of the company, never ran. Her family, meanwhile, was spiraling. After her disappearance in 1977, they'd launched a desperate search. Flyers, missing person reports, pleas on the local news, nothing yielded results. As months passed with no answers, theories spread. Some believed she'd joined a cult. Others thought she'd run away. Her mother never gave up hope. But as years passed, the pain became unbearable. Then something changed. In 1981, 4 years after the abduction, Cameron told Colleen she could visit her family. He said the company had approved a brief reunion under strict conditions. She would be monitored. If she said anything, if she tried to escape, her family would be killed. Colleen, terrified yet desperate, agreed. The reunion was surreal. Her family was overjoyed to see her alive, but confused. She looked thin, quiet, different, and her explanations were vague. She said she joined a religious group and wasn't allowed to talk much about it. They had questions but didn't want to push too hard and risk losing her again. After the visit, Colleen returned voluntarily to her captors. Her family, though puzzled, assumed she had made her choices freely. No one imagined the nightmare she was still trapped in. The power of psychological captivity is difficult to grasp. Colleen had been so thoroughly conditioned that even when the door was open, she didn't walk out. Cameron's grip on her mind was absolute. He escalated his fantasies, planning to take a second slave and build a more elaborate dungeon beneath his house. He began constructing soundproof walls and traps. Colleen, though terrified, began to see the cracks in his lies. But it would take something more to break the illusion completely. That something came not from Colleen but from Janice. After years of watching her husband spiral deeper into sadism, Janice had reached a breaking point. She feared what he might do next, not just to Colleen but to their children. She began questioning everything: the morality, the lies, the life they were living. And one day, after a particularly disturbing conversation about his future plans, Janice made a decision that would change everything. She told Colleen the truth. There was no company. There never had been. The revelation shattered everything Colleen believed. Years of fear and obedience, all based on a fiction. The chains weren't real, but their scars were. She was free to go, free to live, free to speak. But escape wasn't simple. Even with the truth revealed, Colleen was emotionally broken, unsure of what to do or who to trust. Janice promised to help. She took Colleen to a bus station, and for the first time in 7 years, Colleen Stan stepped into the world as a free woman. The journey to healing, however, was just beginning, and justice had not yet been served. The nights, if they could still be called that, grew longer. Time had no meaning anymore. Inside that box, minutes bled into hours, hours into eternities. Colleen's body ached from the confinement, her skin raw from friction, her limbs atrophying. But worse than the physical torment was the isolation, the sheer, unrelenting emptiness. It gnawed at her thoughts, warped her memories. She no longer knew what day it was, or what month, or if anyone in the world even remembered she existed. And yet, Cameron did. He never forgot. He would return, sometimes daily, sometimes after long stretches of absence that made her believe he had abandoned her, that maybe she would simply die in the dark, unheard, unfound. But then the box would open, light would pour in, burning her retinas, and Cameron's face, always calm, always in control, would greet her. She began to see him not as a man, but as a force, like gravity or time, inescapable, immutable. He began taking her out for longer intervals, testing her limits, measuring her obedience. Could she kneel without instruction? Could she hold her gaze downward, never daring to look into his eyes? Could she answer only when spoken to, say, master, with the exact right tone? Each success earned her a strange reward. Extra food, fewer hours in the box, a moment to stretch her legs. It was conditioning and it worked. But the horror was how normal it began to feel. At one point, he gave her a mirror, just for a minute. She didn't recognize herself. Her face was gaunt, lips cracked, hair tangled and lifeless. But her eyes held something deeper than pain. They held knowledge, a haunting awareness that this was her life now, that maybe this would never end. Cameron, emboldened by her compliance, began integrating her into the household. When Janice wasn't around, he'd make Colleen cook, clean, even care for the houseplants, all under his watchful eye. The leash never came off, even when invisible. One day he sat her down, told her she was doing well, told her he loved her, told her he planned to build a shed in the backyard, a place where she could live permanently. Not a box, a room, with space, and maybe children. Colleen's stomach turned. Not because of the shed, but because she almost believed him. The human mind is terrifyingly adaptable. And when escape seems impossible, survival starts to look like submission. Janice watched this transformation with unease. She had convinced herself that Colleen was there by choice now, that her role was more servant than prisoner. But somewhere deep down, the truth screamed, and that scream began to claw its way out. It happened slowly, in hushed confessions, in sideways glances, in the tremble of her voice whenever she said Cameron's name. Janice was unraveling, and with her unraveling came cracks. Cracks Colleen could finally see. She began to push, just a little. Questions, small ones. What does he do when you're not here? Have you ever thought of leaving? Do you believe the company is real? At first, Janice recoiled, but then she didn't. She started bringing Colleen old books. Nothing dangerous, just fiction. Paperbacks she hid under the mattress. Stories of other lives, other people, freedom. Then one day she gave her a Bible. Not because of religion, but because it gave Colleen a sense of control. A ritual. Pages she could flip. Words she could memorize. Ideas she could hold onto when the darkness closed in. And it did. Often. Cameron noticed the shift. He tightened the rules, reinstated punishments, threatened Janice, threatened Colleen. The box returned more frequently now, and each time Colleen descended into it, she wondered, will this be the last time I ever see the sky? But the shift had already begun. Inside her, the flicker had grown into a flame. She began imagining escape again, not like before, wild, desperate, impulsive. This time it was careful, strategic, a whispered rebellion shared between two broken women. Because Janice, too, was beginning to believe in something else. That maybe they could stop him. That maybe she could stop him. The moment came unexpectedly. Cameron was out, working late. Janice approached Colleen, no longer whispering. Her voice was firm, clear. We need to talk. Colleen sat frozen, expecting a trap. But Janice pulled out a key. I'm letting you out. Not for an hour. Not for a day. You're going to your family. Colleen shook her head. The company. There is no company, Janice said. There never was. It was like thunder cracking across the sky. The illusion shattered. The spell broke. Tears rolled down Colleen's cheeks. But she didn't sob. She couldn't. Her body didn't remember how. Janice gave her a dress, a little money, directions, and then she opened the door. Colleen stepped outside. The air hit her like ice. The sun, real sunlight, burned her skin. Her legs trembled beneath her, unused to walking more than a few paces at a time. But she kept moving, step by step, street by street, toward a phone, toward her past, toward freedom. But still, she didn't call the police. Not right away. That's how deep the brainwashing went. She called Cameron, told him she was safe, told him she was thinking, told him she'd come back. And she meant it. It would take months before Colleen truly accepted the truth. That she had been a prisoner. That the world was not watching. That no one would be killed for her freedom. And Janice? She turned herself in, walked into a police station, confessed everything, and in doing so brought the monster down. Cameron Hooker was arrested. He was charged with kidnapping, torture, sexual assault, and imprisonment. The trial revealed the depths of his manipulation. The contracts, the box, the lies. Colleen testified, her voice calm, measured, almost surreal. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as she described years of servitude. Years in darkness. Years in the box. Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison. And Colleen? She began to rebuild, piece by piece, day by day, not as a victim, but as a survivor, because she had done the impossible. She had escaped. The seasons changed. Winters turned to springs, and summers passed into autumns. But inside that wooden box, time stood still. For Colleen Stan, days melted into nights in an endless loop of silence, pain, and psychological manipulation. The chains weren't just around her ankles, they were in her mind now. And that's exactly how Cameron Hooker wanted it. After the initial months of confinement, the fear that had once screamed inside her had dulled into a numb survival instinct. But Cameron, always calculating, always watching, wanted more than obedience. He wanted loyalty, and so he escalated his plan. One morning, without warning, he removed the chains. Colleen didn't know what to expect. A test, a trap, or maybe an execution. But instead, Cameron led her into the kitchen. Janice, his wife, sat at the table, eyes fixed on the floor. The tension was unbearable. Then Cameron said something that made Colleen's blood run cold. "You're free to walk around the house now. You've earned our trust." The words didn't bring comfort. They brought confusion. How could someone trust a person they'd locked in a coffin for months? But she obeyed. She always obeyed. Colleen now had limited movement. She cooked. She cleaned. She ate meals with the Hookers, a grotesque parody of a family dinner. And yet, each moment was orchestrated, each interaction carefully calculated to break her further. But the worst was yet to come. One night, Cameron sat her down in the living room. Janice watched silently. Then, with terrifying calm, Cameron introduced her to the company. He told her it was a powerful secret organization, that they monitored her every move, that if she ever tried to escape, the company would kill her, her family, everyone she loved. He showed her fabricated documents, contracts, surveillance photos, names, and codes. To a young woman, isolated and psychologically broken, it felt real. Colleen signed a contract with trembling hands, agreeing to be Cameron's slave for life. It was grotesque, but in her mind, the alternative was worse. That moment marked a new phase of control. Colleen wasn't just a prisoner now. She was a programmed captive, mentally shackled to a fantasy more dangerous than any cage. Cameron didn't need to lock the box anymore. She was already trapped inside her own fear. And then came the tests. Cameron would let her walk outside, sometimes in the backyard, other times even beyond. But never far. Always supervised. Always reminded that the company was watching. Colleen never ran. She never screamed. The invisible chains were stronger than steel. Over time, she was allowed to write letters to her family. But Cameron dictated the content. Cheerful lies, fake updates, careful omissions. Her parents, thousands of miles away, believed she was just traveling, perhaps going through a phase. After all, she said she was happy. She sounded fine. And the letters kept coming. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Cameron had built an illusion so complete, even Colleen's own family didn't suspect the truth. Then, in a moment that would seem impossible to outsiders, Cameron took the illusion even further. He allowed Colleen to visit her family. It had been over 3 years since she had seen them. She was terrified, not because of her parents, but because of the company. Cameron had drilled it into her so deeply that even as she hugged her mother, even as she sat down to dinner with her family, the only thing she could think about was surveillance. Were there microphones in the house? Was someone watching from across the street? Would the company kill her if she said the wrong thing? So she smiled. She told them she had joined a religious group, that she was safe, that she was happy. Her parents were confused, but the joy of seeing their daughter alive overpowered the inconsistencies in her story. They didn't press. They didn't ask too much. And after the visit, Colleen returned to Cameron voluntarily. It sounds unthinkable, but this is the power of psychological warfare. She believed escape meant death. Not just her own, but the death of everyone she loved. The box was gone now, replaced by invisible walls of manipulation. Cameron even tried to take the relationship further. He wanted Colleen to become his second wife, a twisted dream of polygamous submission. But Janice, who had tolerated years of this nightmare, finally snapped. She had lived under Cameron's domination too, and now, seeing him try to elevate Colleen to the same level as her, something broke inside her. For the first time, she began to question everything. Janice had long justified Cameron's actions under the guise of religion and obedience, but now she saw it for what it was: pure evil. She began to secretly speak with Colleen, moments stolen away when Cameron wasn't around. These conversations became lifelines, quiet exchanges that carried more weight than either woman could express. Then, after nearly 7 years, the unthinkable happened. Cameron grew complacent. He began to believe his own fantasy. He stopped watching as closely, stopped threatening as often. The illusion began to crack. And in that crack, Janice found the courage to act. One afternoon, she took Colleen aside and whispered the words that shattered the chains once and for all. "There is no company. It was all a lie." Colleen stared at her in disbelief. Years of fear collapsed in an instant. Her mind couldn't process it. Could it really be fake? Could the threats have been empty? Janice explained everything: how Cameron had fabricated it, how it was part of his control, how she had helped him build the illusion out of fear, guilt, and manipulation. For Colleen, it was like waking from a nightmare she didn't know she was in. And then came the hardest part. She had to walk away, not run, not escape in the middle of the night, just walk out. And so, one morning, Colleen picked up a phone and called her family. She said she was ready to come home. And this time, there were no scripts, no lies, no company. Cameron let her go, because he didn't believe she would ever betray him. He thought he had broken her so completely, she would always return. But he was wrong. Colleen went home, and for the first time in 7 years, she slept in a real bed, without chains, without fear. But the story wasn't over. The world still didn't know what had happened. Cameron Hooker was still free, and Colleen, now safe but deeply traumatized, was faced with the ultimate decision: speak out and risk everything, or stay silent and let the monster walk free. That question would define the final chapter of her captivity and the beginning of her justice. Time no longer existed for Colleen. The days bled into each other like an oil spill, dark and endless. The sun, when it touched her face through the cracks of the wooden box, no longer symbolized hope. It simply marked the passage of another cycle, another eternity. Inside that coffin-like enclosure, every sound became amplified. Cameron's boots stomping on the floor above, the metallic squeal of the door hinges, the dragging sound of a chair. Every noise kept her heart in a perpetual rhythm of fear. But it wasn't always about fear anymore. Sometimes the silence was worse. One afternoon, she heard something strange. Crying. Soft, muffled sobs. Not hers, not Janice's. It was Cameron, the monster who'd stolen her freedom, crying. That single, inexplicable moment fractured something inside Colleen. Confusion took over. She hated him, yes, but how could he, her captor, be suffering? Cameron began descending more frequently. but his tone had changed. It wasn't anger now. It was gentleness, artificial, rehearsed, like he was trying to be her savior, not her captor. He told her stories about the company, a vast, shadowy organization that controlled him, that owned her. He claimed he was just a pawn, a victim like her. Colleen didn't believe him, not fully, but her isolation had softened her resistance. And when you're trapped long enough, even a whisper of humanity from your captor becomes a lifeline. He began giving her a little more freedom. One day, he opened the box and let her sit outside. The basement still reeked of mildew, but after so many months in darkness, it felt like heaven. The light stung her eyes, but the burn reminded her she was still alive. She stretched, feeling her muscles scream with atrophy. Every movement was a rediscovery. Then, slowly, Cameron introduced more changes. He allowed her to wash. He let her speak. She started eating at a small table instead of the floor. To an outsider, it would seem like kindness. But to Colleen, it was manipulation perfectly crafted. He made her sign a document, a slave contract, a chilling formality where Colleen agreed to serve Cameron for the rest of her life. He made her address him as master, and Janice as ma'am. He reinforced the belief that if she disobeyed, the company would come. They'd kill her. Or worse, she didn't scream, she didn't run, because somewhere along the way reality had bent. And Cameron knew it. Colleen was being brainwashed systematically, clinically, and she was aware of it, yet powerless to stop it. On Sundays, he'd take her outside. Not far, just into the backyard, blindfolded. She felt grass beneath her bare feet, heard birds, the wind through trees. Her heart soared in those moments, and crashed just as quickly when the blindfold returned. Then came the biggest shift. One day, Cameron announced he was taking her somewhere. Colleen's heart raced. Escape? Exposure? Death? No. He drove her, blindfolded, to his parents' house. She was dressed modestly. He told her to behave. Smile, he said, or they'll call the company. She obeyed. She smiled. She played the role. And no one suspected a thing. She poured coffee, laughed politely. Cameron's parents complimented her manners. She's sweet, they said. It was a surreal performance, but it worked. And Cameron grew bolder. He brought her on more trips, grocery stores, restaurants, always supervised, always with the threat of death hanging over her like a guillotine. The blindfold only came off inside safe zones. Still, the freedom, the taste of normalcy was addictive. But it wasn't freedom. It was leash-length liberty. And every inch she gained came with 1,000 invisible chains. Back at the mobile home, Colleen was allowed upstairs. She cooked, cleaned, watched TV. But at night, she still returned to the box. The illusion had limits. One evening, as she scrubbed the sink, Janice approached. Her voice trembled. "You're going to be free soon," she whispered. Colleen froze. Her hands, soaked in soapy water, trembled. Janice continued, "He's losing control. He doesn't see it. But I do." It was the first time Janice acknowledged what they both knew. That this wasn't obedience. It was survival. Days later, Cameron told Colleen something shocking. He wanted her to marry him. He said it casually, like he was asking what she wanted for dinner. "You're my wife in the eyes of God," he said. "Let's make it real." Colleen stared blankly, unsure how to respond. Every fiber of her screamed, but she nodded. "Yes, master." In her mind, something changed. She knew now. She couldn't wait for rescue. She had to survive long enough for an opening. A crack in the wall. An error in Cameron's pattern. That moment came not long after. Cameron had started working again. Janice was alone with Colleen more often. And Janice was different. She started slipping, crying openly, avoiding Cameron's gaze. The weight of the lies crushed her. Then one morning, she broke. "I can't do this anymore," Janice sobbed. "I'm going to take you to your family." Colleen's breath caught. She didn't speak. She didn't believe it. Not fully. But Janice meant it. And a week later, she followed through. The day was quiet. Cameron had gone to work. Janice unlocked the box and told Colleen to get dressed. No blindfold, no leash, just clothes. Real ones. They got in the car. Every turn felt like a dream. Every intersection a possible trap. But Janice kept driving, mile after mile, until they reached a phone booth. "Call your parents," she said. Colleen's hands shook as she dialed. She didn't even know if the number still worked. But then her mother's voice, the sound shattered her. She collapsed, sobbing. 7 years. 7 years in a box. And now her voice was reaching home. The FBI came soon after. They arrested Cameron. The media exploded with the story. The world now knew. Colleen Stan had been kept as a sex slave, in a coffin-sized box, for 7 years, right under everyone's noses. The trial that followed was brutal. Cameron claimed she had consented, that it was all voluntary, that she loved him, but the truth was undeniable. The box, the slave contract, the threats, the control, the fear, the psychological warfare. Colleen testified with a quiet strength. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She told the truth. Cameron Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Janice was granted immunity for her cooperation. And Colleen was free. But what does freedom look like after so much captivity? That question lingered in the minds of millions who followed the case. And for Colleen, it was a journey that was only just beginning. The morning of May 28, 1984, was deceptively ordinary in the small town of Red Bluff. The air was still, the sun rising through a quiet fog, and the streets beginning to stir with the rhythm of daily life. But inside the pale green mobile home, something extraordinary was unfolding. A moment that would change everything. For the first time in 7 years, Colleen Stan stepped outside. Alone. She had been ordered by Cameron Hooker to deliver a letter to his employer. It was a simple task, but to Colleen it felt like a crack in the prison walls. One she could slip through if she moved carefully. The imaginary empire of the company had governed her every move for years, poisoning her with fear, conditioning her to silence. But that morning, something inside her had shifted. As she walked out, the summer light touched her skin like a foreign sensation. Her heart raced with the weight of uncertainty. But Cameron wasn't watching. Janice wasn't following. And for the first time in years, the road was open. She went to work and came back just as she had been told. But the next day, with trembling hands and a whisper of courage, she made a call. Not to the police, but to her father. It was the first step toward shattering the silence. Janice had been watching the unraveling with growing panic. Colleen's presence in their home, unbound and less controlled, threatened the delicate equilibrium Cameron had forced upon them all. After years of complicity, denial, and religious guilt, Janice broke. She took Colleen aside, her voice shaking. She confessed what Colleen had feared and never dared speak aloud. There is no company. There had never been one. It was all Cameron, the threats, the punishments, the fear. It had all come from him. The mysterious organization that held Colleen's life hostage didn't exist. The revelation didn't immediately spark rage. It sparked grief. 7 years. 7 years lived in a box, in chains, in terror, for a lie. Colleen broke down. The foundation of her reality crumbled beneath her, and in its place came something else. Clarity. She packed a small bag. Janice drove her to a bus station. There were no goodbyes. Colleen Stan disappeared into the crowd, free for the first time since 1977. It would be months before the full truth surfaced. First, Colleen didn't go to the police. She returned to her family in Oregon, tried to adjust, to breathe, to feel human again. But the trauma had rewired her completely. For days, she slept on the floor. She flinched at loud voices. And at night, she would lie awake, half expecting the box to close around her again. Her family was overjoyed, but they didn't understand. How could they? The news of her return was kept quiet at first. But Janice, now spiraling in guilt, fear, and religious repentance, finally contacted her pastor. She told him everything, and he told her what she didn't want to hear. "You have to go to the police." So she did. In November 1984, Cameron Hooker was arrested. The police were stunned by the details. It sounded like a horror movie, a sex dungeon, a homemade box, psychological torture, cult-like manipulation. They didn't believe it at first. But Janice, now cooperating fully, gave them evidence, photos, notes, the box itself. Colleen testified. The trial was agonizing. Cameron's defense painted Colleen as a willing participant. They called it BDSM gone wrong. They twisted the narrative, emphasized her trips outside, her letters to home, her return after brief freedoms. But Colleen, though fragile, stood firm. Her voice wavered, but the truth held. She told the jury about the first box, the contracts, the threats about the company, the rape, the beatings, the years in the coffin-like box under the bed, 23 hours a day in silence, in the dark. And the jury listened. In 1985, Cameron Hooker was found guilty of kidnapping and multiple sexual assaults. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. But the real battle was just beginning. For Colleen, freedom was a puzzle she had to reassemble piece by piece. She wasn't the same girl who had hitchhiked to Northern California in 1977. That girl was naive, open-hearted, trusting. The woman who returned had survived one of the most harrowing ordeals imaginable. She struggled with shame, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Relationships were hard. Trust was hard. The world felt too big, too loud, too unreal. She changed her name, started therapy. Slowly, she rebuilt her identity from scratch. And then, in an act of profound courage, she decided to speak. Colleen began telling her story publicly in the 1990s, not for sympathy, but to help others understand the insidious nature of psychological captivity. To reveal that control isn't always about chains and locks. Sometimes it's about lies, beliefs, fear so deep it silences every instinct to escape. Her bravery inspired others. She became a symbol not of victimhood, but of survival. The box, the actual wooden structure Cameron had used, was preserved by police. A dark, crude coffin-like cell with air holes, padding, and a locking mechanism. It became physical proof of the horror she had endured. Reporters dubbed her the girl in the box. The media pounced on the story. Documentaries were made. True crime series dissected every detail. But for Colleen, the nickname was bittersweet. It simplified something complex, turned her pain into a headline, because she wasn't just the girl in the box. She was the girl who got out. As the years passed, Colleen built a quiet life. She found work helping others, spoke at events, shared her experience not as entertainment, but as warning and hope. She forgave Janice Hooker, a decision many couldn't understand. But in her eyes, Janice had helped her escape. And in some twisted way, she had been a prisoner too. Cameron Hooker remains behind bars. As of his last hearings, his requests for parole have been denied. And it's likely he will die in prison. But Colleen's story isn't about him. It's about the strength to endure, to survive, to reclaim identity and humanity after being dehumanized. It's about what happens when someone refuses to be defined by their darkest chapter. What makes her story so powerful isn't just the cruelty she endured. It's the silence that followed. The world around her went on. Elections happened. Fads came and went. People laughed and loved. While she lived beneath a bed, unseen, unheard. The world forgot her. But she didn't forget herself. Even when hope was microscopic, buried beneath fear, it never died. And when the chance finally came, the moment to walk away, to break the spell, she took it. Not many do. Today, Colleen Stan lives in anonymity. She rarely speaks to the media now, but her story remains one of the most haunting and inspiring survival tales in modern history. And perhaps that's the lesson. That even in the most suffocating darkness, the human spirit can adapt, endure, and, eventually, escape. Her story reminds us to look deeper, to ask questions when things don't seem right, to recognize that abuse isn't always visible, and that bravery isn't always loud. Because sometimes, survival is quiet. It happens in whispers, in footsteps taken alone, in a phone call home, in a breath of fresh air after years of stillness. And it happens incredibly in boxes. If you've been moved by this story, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you powerful real-life narratives that deserve to be remembered. Your support helps us uncover more hidden stories, more voices that refuse to be silenced. Thank you for watching.